Well, good afternoon, everybody, and Happy New Year. It's great to be here with you today. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some information about the Gulf oil spill. And thank you to Patricia Miller for inviting me to be a part of the Nature at Noontime program. I'm very excited. I'm going to show you some pictures. I'm going to show you some samples, some contraband. I've got some handouts that you're welcome to take with you, and I have a email sign up for those of you who want those handouts electronically. I will be happy to send them to you as attachments later this week. And I want to allow some time at the end for questions and suggestions and ideas of how we can teach students and teachers and other educators and the general public about the oil spill and about its impacts on the Gulf Coast and the rest of the nation. Because truly, the reason that I'm still talking about it is because I don't want it to ever happen again. So if we can prevent that, then my job will be done. And as Patricia told you, I work as a naturalist at Land Between the Lakes, the National Recreation Area up there in western Kentucky. And I work as an aquatic education specialist for the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. Been there 4 years. My husband and I are victims of Hurricane Ivan. So we moved to western Kentucky to get away from the storms, and since we've lived there, we've had 2 ice storms, 2 tornadoes, a drought, a flood, an earthquake, and a hurricane. Hurricane Ike came through there, so I'm not sure if that idea panned out or not. But it has been a good experience. A transplanted marine biologist working with freshwater fishes in western Kentucky. And I am born in Mobile, Alabama, and grew up on the Gulf Coast. I'm going to try to get this remote to work for me. My parents were both school principals, so we spent 9 months of the year in Mobile and 3 months of the summer every year in Orange Beach or Gulf Shores. So we were beach bums, and we filled up our days with swimming and windsurfing and water skiing, and grew to love the Gulf very much. And then I went into marine biology and worked as a marine extension agent for 20 years for Florida and Alabama, for Florida Sea Grant and the Alabama Cooperative Extension Service. So I still have a home there in Orange Beach that we try to get down to about 6 times a year that my dad and I own together. So I spent a lot of time on the Gulf and worked there as well, and it is near and dear to my heart. So raise your hand if you've been to the Gulf Coast. All right. And there is a strong connection with this area. Not only are you part of the Southeast, so part of this region, but also many people spend their vacations and their spring breaks down there on the Gulf Coast. So I do know that most of you will recognize the names of the towns and communities that I'm going to be talking about. I grew up in Mobile, and in 1982, they began to put in natural gas rigs inshore and nearshore and oil rigs offshore. And to date, there are over 400 of those just along the North Gulf Coast. On April 20th, my husband Larry and I were out in Rio Doso, New Mexico at a forestry conference. One of our colleagues came up to us and told us that the Deepwater Horizon had exploded, and his brother worked on offshore rigs off of Louisiana, and his brother's best friend was one of the 11 men who were killed in that explosion. So immediately there was a very serious connection for us. Larry ended up attending that memorial service with his forestry friend. This was a big explosion, and it's one that kept going, unfortunately, for months. April 20th through about August 20th was the impact of that time period. And down in Mobile, the CBS network is called WKRG, and that television station had a wonderful website that showed off the impacts of the oil spill for months. And they had a ticker up at the top that rotated every time a gallon of oil came into the Gulf of Mexico from the gash. And at one point in June, the ticker could not keep up with the gallons of oil that were pouring into the Gulf. They had to shut it down and reconfigure it so that it could jump in tins instead of single gallons. By the time it was capped, 210 million gallons of oil, light crude oil, yes, but still oil, poured into the Gulf of Mexico. And the first thing that I learned was all the forms that oil can take. The first thing I saw was oil sheen, which is like you're putting gas in your car at the gas station and there's a puddle there and you get a few drops of gasoline in that puddle. It's kind of a rainbow on that puddle. And so it's clear, but you can still see it in the water and it's very distinctive. And this was the first thing that came into shore in Mississippi and Alabama. The next is oil patties. This looks like someone's herd of cattle got too close to the shoreline. And oil can come in many different colors, from clear to green to red to orange to brown to very dark black. And so these happen to be brownish and they float on the surface and in big globs, from like pancake size to about 2 feet wide. This is oil mousse, and this is what happens when a tropical storm or hurricane comes through and stirs up the big waves that crash onto the shore and whips up that oil on the surface into a hot fudge sundae kind of mousse. And then it actually splashes it onto the beach, like if I held an egg beater up and just splattered it around the room. So it's kind of a violent place to be during a storm. I brought some oil samples to share with you, and I'm going to pass these around. This is some oil mousse, and if y'all would just take that and pass it around, you can see the consistency of it. And this particular kind of oil during the day is, especially in the summer when it's hot, is liquid, and at night it cools and hardens again. So it takes several different forms as it's sitting there on the beach. This is weathered oil, and that's just oil that's been out there on the beach. The sun is shining down on it, the sand is resistant and rubbing on it, and so it's starting to weather. Still there, but slowly breaking down. And this can actually be more dangerous than the original light crude oil. I knew nothing about oil except that my car holds 5 quarts of AMSOIL 10W40. That was all I knew before this. But oil is poison. It's toxic. And as those sulfur compounds start to break down, they release hydrogen sulfides. And if you breathe those, you can have respiratory problems, you can have nausea, you can have liquid pneumonia, you can have life-threatening respiratory diseases if you ingest any of it. Obviously it's toxic, it's a poison. We did the metals test on the Gulf of Mexico, and just offshore from Gulf Shores, Alabama, we tested the water, and the nickel levels were 400 times higher than they were before the oil spill. 400 times. I don't even know what nickel does to you, but that cannot be good. So the more that the oil breaks down, the more it releases these hydrocarbons into the water, into the air, or into your system. So when I stole these things off the beach and took them home, I had to leave them in an outside storage area that was somewhat shaded and open, so that as they released those noxious gases, they were away from myself and my husband and our pets. And then finally I was able to cap them. This is oil mixed with dispersants. And almost immediately when the oil spill happened, BP and the U.S. Air Force started flying over and releasing chemical dispersants onto the surface of the water and also under the water at the site of the oil spill. Millions of gallons of chemical dispersants. And what the dispersant does is it breaks down the oil and causes it to sink into the water column and eventually down to the bottom. And as it sinks, it breaks apart and it releases those hydrocarbons. So it's actually worse in a number of different ways. First of all, it's harder to see. So you can't find it, to collect it, to remove it as easily. And secondly, as it breaks down the oil and releases it into the water column and those hydrocarbons are more available, then the marine life that's coming through there, either feeding or just swimming through, is going to be more exposed to the toxicity. So it would have been a lot better to have left it on the surface in big flat globs that could be skimmed up. But we have a lot of reasons why BP might have done that, and the first was out of sight, out of mind. So they were trying to get rid of it as quickly as possible. Sea Grant did research about 10 years ago and found that adding dispersants causes it to be about 1,000 times more toxic than just leaving it as a light crude oil on the surface. Tar balls, and some of you may remember back in the 70s going down to the beach, either the Atlantic beach or the Gulf, and walking along and stepping on a little tar ball and using baby oil to get it off of your heel. That was from ocean-going vessels that were transporting light crude, and maybe they hit some rough seas and lost a little bit of it. And occasionally you would find, maybe in a summer, you'd encounter half a dozen of those tar balls. Imagine 600 miles of tar balls. That is what happened after the wind and waves started bringing this oil on shore. And so it made it pretty hard to spend any time on the beach at all. Oiled seashells, every seashell that was on the beach got oil on it, and it stayed on the shell. So then all those shells had to be removed as well. So the oil spill workers got to be good shell collectors. This is Sargassum seaweed. It's the most common kind of seaweed that we have out in the Gulf of Mexico. It spends most of its time offshore, and it's a light orange-brown color typically. That is where little baby shrimp and little baby crabs and small fishes spend out their lives protected from predators and feeding off of each other. And that's where the little sea turtle hatchlings go to feed on those little baby shrimp and baby crabs. So it's usually offshore, but when high seas or big storms come, they'll push it into shore like this. And normally it's not harmful to anything. Here is what oiled sargassum seaweed looks like. It turns stiff and coated with this oil, dark black, dead, of course, and everything in it is dead as well. So I'm passing around some oiled sargassum seaweed for you to see what that looked like. This is Pensacola Beach, high tide line, June 24th, solid oiled sargassum seaweed. So all of that had to be collected with heavy vehicles and hauled to not just any landfill, but a hazardous landfill, and in fact it went to Emile, Alabama, which is the big hazardous waste site for the Gulf Coast. And then I did not realize that this might happen, but I went down to the beach and was digging in the sand and spent a couple of hours taking pictures, talking to oil spill workers, poking around. And my eyes were red and burning, my throat was raspy, I was having trouble swallowing, having trouble breathing, and I thought, I'm getting sick, I'm coming down with something. And then I talked to the oil spill workers, and they're all rubbing their eyes and raspy coughing. And that's when I realized that the wind was coming out of the southwest, so it was coming from offshore of Louisiana directly towards us. It was a strong wind, and they were burning oil offshore. So we were breathing that burning oil, and it was not pleasant. In fact, people 30 miles inland, especially seniors who had respiratory concerns anyway, were complaining of those same problems. And so it was in the water, it was on the beach, and now it was in the air that we were breathing. Then we went down to look at the high dunes in areas where we thought they were safe from the oil. The oil had not washed up onto the shore that high, and we took white napkins and rubbed them along the stem of the sea oats on those high dunes, and this is what we found. I'll pass a napkin around for you. So the oil was there. It had been blown by the wind up into the high dunes and collected on all the plants up there. In fact, by the end of the summer, those plants were soaked with a sheen of oil, and definitely affected by it as well. So we talked to the meteorologist at NOAA, and we said, what might happen if a hurricane, a real hurricane, comes through here? And they said, we know what you're thinking, and yes, it will rain oil. Because as a big storm comes through, it draws up water from the surface of the Gulf, and then as it comes over the land, it dumps that water. And so yeah, you're going to have oil rain.